What happens when your family thinks you're dead for 30 years and you walk through that door? Stop the tape. Dr. Phil's voice cut through the studio like a knife. The cameras froze. The audience held their breath. Because standing in front of him was a woman whose existence had been erased 3 decades ago, and the family who had mourned her all those years was sitting right there, 10 feet away, with no idea she was alive. What happened in the next 7 minutes would become the most emotional moment in Dr. Phil history. The show had started normally enough. Today we're talking about families torn apart by addiction, Dr. Phil announced to the studio audience. On stage sat the Morrison family, Robert, 78, his daughter Linda, 52, and his grandson Michael, 28. They had come to discuss the loss that had defined their lives for 3 decades. My wife disappeared in 1994, Robert explained, his voice trembling. Margaret. We searched for 2 years. Police found her car abandoned near the Mexico border. We held a funeral with an empty casket. Linda wiped tears from her eyes. I was 22 when my mother vanished. I got married, had children, built a life, all without her. My son never met his grandmother. Dr. Phil listened with that intense focus he's known for, leaning forward in his chair. And you believe addiction played a role in her disappearance? But Dr. Phil already knew something the Morrison family didn't. Something that would shatter and rebuild their world in the same breath. During the commercial break, Dr. Phil did something unprecedented. He stood up, walked off stage, and went directly to the backstage holding area. The crew watched in confusion as he broke every protocol in the book. Bring her out now, he told the producer. Not after the segment. Not during the planned reveal. Now. The producer hesitated. Dr. Phil, we had a whole sequence planned. I don't care about the sequence. Dr. Phil interrupted, his voice firm but not angry. That man is 78 years old. His wife has been gone for 30 years. Every second we make him wait is cruelty. Bring her out now. Nobody in the studio, not the crew, not the audience, not the family, knew that Margaret Morrison was alive and standing 20 feet away behind a curtain. When they came back from commercial, Dr. Phil didn't return to his usual chair. He stood center stage, and his demeanor had completely changed. The practiced TV host persona was gone. This was Phil McGraw, the human being. Robert, Linda, Michael, he began slowly. What I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to process. I need you to take a deep breath with me. The family exchanged confused glances. Linda reached for her father's hand. Sometimes, Dr. Phil continued, his voice measured and gentle. The story we've been told isn't the whole story. Sometimes people we've mourned aren't actually gone. The studio went completely silent. You could hear the air conditioning system humming. Robert's face went pale. What are you saying? Dr. Phil turned toward the backstage entrance. Margaret, you can come out now. The moment stretched like taffy. Then a woman emerged from behind the curtain, gray-haired, weathered by time and struggle, wearing a simple blue dress. She was 73 years old, and she was Margaret Morrison. Robert stood up so fast his chair almost tipped over. No, he whispered. No, that can't be. Linda's hands flew to her mouth. A sound escaped her throat that was part sob, part gasp. Michael sat frozen, staring at the grandmother he'd only seen in photographs. Dr. Phil paused mid-sentence. The studio went completely silent. Margaret took 3 tentative steps forward, then stopped, as if an invisible wall prevented her from going further. Tears were already streaming down her face. Robert, she said, and her voice cracked on his name. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Subscribe and leave a comment. Because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Dr. Phil did something then that he rarely does. He stepped back, creating space for the moment to unfold organically. No questions, no analysis, no intervention. Just silence and space. Robert moved first. He walked toward Margaret slowly, like a man approaching a mirage that might disappear. When he was close enough to touch her, he stopped. Is it really you? His voice was barely audible. It's me, Margaret whispered. It's really me. They stood there for what felt like an eternity. Two people separated by 3 decades of pain and silence, now within reach of each other. Then Robert lifted his hand and gently touched her face, as if verifying she was solid and real. That touch broke something. Margaret collapsed forward into his arms, and Robert caught her, and they held each other while 30 years of grief poured out in waves. Off camera, Dr. Phil made a choice no producer expected. He signaled to cut to commercial early. The crew was confused. They were capturing television gold, but Dr. Phil was insistent. He walked over to Linda, who was sobbing in her seat, unable to move. Do you want to go to them? He asked quietly. Linda nodded but couldn't stand. Her legs wouldn't work. Dr. Phil offered his hand, helped her up, and physically walked her to her parents. When Linda reached Margaret, she simply said, "Mom?" as if testing whether the words still worked after 30 years. "Baby," Margaret responded, opening one arm to include her daughter in the embrace. "My baby girl." The audience was openly crying. Several crew members had tears running down their faces. Even the cameramen were struggling to keep their shots steady. When they returned from commercial, the family was seated together on the couch, Margaret between Robert and Linda, Michael sitting close but still processing. Dr. Phil had brought them all water and tissues. His sleeves were rolled up slightly, his tie loosened. The polish of the TV show had been stripped away, leaving only raw humanity. "Margaret," Dr. Phil said gently, "when you're ready, help us understand what happened." Margaret took a shaky breath. Her hand was clasped tightly in Robert's, as if she was afraid he might disappear if she let go. "In 1994 I was drowning," she began. "I had been addicted to prescription pills for 3 years. I was stealing money from our savings. I was lying about everything. And I hated myself so much that I believed you would all be better off without me." Robert shook his head. "Margaret, please," she said. "Let me finish. I drove to Mexico thinking I would end my life. But I couldn't do it. Instead, I checked myself into a clinic in Tijuana. I told them I had no family, no identification, nothing. I wanted to disappear completely. But what happened next is something no one in the room, or watching at home, saw coming. I spent 18 months in that clinic," Margaret continued. "And then another 3 years in a halfway house. By the time I was clean and thinking clearly, 5 years had passed. I convinced myself it was too late. That you'd moved on. That showing up would only hurt everyone more." Linda's voice was thick with emotion. "So where have you been for 25 years? Working in homeless shelters, mostly. Albuquerque, Phoenix, San Diego. I dedicated my life to helping people like me, people who wanted to disappear. I couldn't save myself in time, but I could save others." Dr. Phil leaned forward. "What changed? Why now?" Margaret pulled out a folded newspaper clipping. 6 months ago, I Googled my own name. I found your obituary, Robert. From 2023. It said you'd passed away." Robert's eyes widened. "But I'm not dead." "I know. But for 2 months, I believed you were. The grief destroyed me. Then I called the funeral home. They said it was a mistake, wrong Robert Morrison. They gave me Linda's number. I called Linda 3 weeks ago," Margaret said. "I told her everything." Linda wiped her eyes. "I told her she was coming on this show. That we needed Dr. Phil's help to do this right." Michael finally spoke. "Why didn't you just come home?" Margaret looked at her grandson. "Because I was a coward. I believed I was protecting you from my brokenness. But I was really protecting myself from facing what I'd done." Dr. Phil stood up and walked to the center of the stage. His voice carried the weight of 3 decades of family therapy experience. "Here's what I want everyone to understand," he said, addressing both the family and the audience. "Addiction doesn't just hurt the addict. It creates a blast radius of pain that touches everyone in the family system. Margaret made a choice in her addiction, a choice to disappear. But she also made a choice in her recovery, a choice to stay away. And that second choice, while made with good intentions, created 30 more years of unnecessary grief. He turned to Margaret. You survived. You got clean. You built a life of service. Those are tremendous achievements. But you also robbed this family of 3 decades of healing together. Margaret nodded, accepting the truth without deflection. You're right. I thought I was sparing them pain. I was really just avoiding my own. The room felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for what Dr. Phil would say next. Robert, Dr. Phil said, you've had about 15 minutes to process the fact that your wife of 50 years, who you thought was dead, is sitting next to you alive. That's not enough time. You're going to go through shock, anger, joy, confusion, all of it. And that's okay. Robert looked at Margaret. I'm angry, he said quietly. I'm so angry I can barely breathe. But I'm also... His voice broke. I'm also grateful she's alive. How can I feel both things? Because you're human, Dr. Phil answered. You're allowed to feel everything. Anger doesn't cancel out love. Grief doesn't cancel out joy. You can hold all of it at the same time. He looked at Linda. And you? You've been without your mother for your entire adult life. You got married without her, had a child without her, became the woman you are without her guidance. You don't owe her immediate forgiveness. You don't owe her anything except honesty about how you feel. Linda nodded, tears still flowing. I'm glad she's alive. But I'm also devastated by all the years we lost. My wedding. Michael's birth. My divorce. All the moments she missed, they're gone forever. They are. Dr. Phil confirmed. And acknowledging that loss is important. This isn't a fairy tale reunion where everything is magically fixed. This is the beginning of a very long, very difficult healing process. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Dr. Phil pulled his chair closer to the family. Here's what's going to happen next. Margaret, you're going to go to the on-site workshop in Tennessee, a place that specializes in family trauma and addiction recovery. Robert, Linda, and Michael, you're all going with her. You're going to spend 2 weeks with trained therapists working through 30 years of pain, anger, and loss. He looked at Margaret. And you're going to tell them everything. Not the sanitized version. The real story. The whole truth. Because healing can happen in partial honesty. Margaret nodded. I'll tell them everything. We've also arranged for you to work with Dr. Jennifer Gold, a specialist in family reconciliation after addiction. Dr. Phil continued. She's going to guide you through rebuilding trust, setting boundaries, and creating a new relationship that honors both the past and the possibility of a future. He pulled out a card from his pocket and handed it to Robert. This is my personal number. Not the show's number. Mine. If any of you need to talk during this process, if it gets too hard, too overwhelming, you call me directly. Day or night. The audience rose to their feet in spontaneous applause. It wasn't celebratory applause. It was the sound of collective catharsis, of witnessing something profoundly human. Dr. Phil stood and helped Margaret to her feet. You don't get to skip the hard parts, he told her firmly but with compassion. You don't get to disappear again when it gets difficult. You've spent 30 years running. That ends today. I know, Margaret said. I'm ready. I'm finally ready. Robert stood too, still holding Margaret's hand. I don't know if I can forgive you, he said. Not yet. Maybe not ever completely. But I know I don't want to lose you again. That's enough, Dr. Phil said. That's more than enough to start with. As the family stood together, broken and whole at the same time, Dr. Phil addressed the camera directly, speaking not as a TV host but as someone who has spent decades in the trenches of human pain. If you're watching this and you're struggling with addiction, hear me clearly. Your family wants you alive more than they want you perfect. Getting help isn't selfish. Staying in hiding is. If you're watching this and someone you love disappeared into addiction, know this. Healing isn't about forgetting the past. It's about learning to carry it differently. He gestured to the Morrison family. This story doesn't have a neat ending because real life doesn't work that way. But it has something better. It has hope. It has presence. It has the possibility of tomorrow. The camera held on the family for a long moment. Robert's hand in Margaret's. Linda's arm around her mother's waist. Michael standing close, still uncertain but present. The photo album open on the table between them, 30 years of history ready to be shared. As the show ended and the lights dimmed, Dr. Phil stayed on stage with the family. He didn't rush off to his next segment. He didn't hand them off to producers. He sat with them, in silence, bearing witness to one of the most profound moments of reconciliation his show had ever seen. Later, in his dressing room, a producer asked him why he'd broken protocol, why he'd revealed Margaret before the planned moment, why he'd given out his personal number. Dr. Phil looked at him like the answer was obvious. Because some things are bigger than television, he said simply. That family lost 30 years. I wasn't going to let them lose another 30 minutes for the sake of dramatic timing. 6 months later, Dr. Phil received a photo in the mail. It showed the Morrison family at Thanksgiving, all together, all present, all fighting their way through the messy, beautiful work of healing. On the back, Margaret had written just 4 words. Thank you for stopping the tape. And that's why, after thousands of episodes and countless stories, Dr. Phil says the Margaret Morrison reunion remains the moment he's most proud of, not because it was good television, but because it was good humanity. The lesson was simple but profound. It's never too late to come home. It's never too late to tell the truth. And it's never too late for a family to choose healing over pride, presence over perfection, and love over loss. This video is a work of fiction inspired by real-life themes. Names, characters, and events are fictional. Any resemblance to real persons is coincidental.